Hello, welcome to the channel. My name's Genuine, and today in this video we're going to look at how to paint dirty, rotten, scuzzy old wood. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like, click subscribe and ding that bell. For now, let's get on with the painty. Righty, so the model we've chosen for today is the old rotten Galleon from the top of the Sea King by Privateer Press, one of the Trollkin models. So, well, it's kind of obvious when I picked them. It's all made of wood, old rotten wooden planks, which will show off the workup pretty nicely. First things first though, we're going to give it an old prime. I use Style & Res through the airbrush, best primer you can come across really. So we give it a nice even coat, nice and even and light. Don't dwell on any one place too long, or you'll flood the model and you'll start mucking up the detail. With that done, all black and primed, we're going to give it a lateral highlight. Lateral highlight is coming in from the upper sides. We're going to aim down so we can show some of the lighter areas of the piece, as well as picking out the grain of the wood on the sides and also on the decking and the mast and the fronty pointy bit. Bowsprit. There we go. So again, we're going to use Style & Res, this time Style & Res white. Shake the absolute bejesus out of it. Load her up and off we go. Again, coming in from a high lateral angle. This is not zenithal angle. Zenithal is when it's from the very, very, very top. This is a lateral angle because I want to actually spray down. And so we get some highlight onto the planks, picking out the edges of the wood grain. And then on the top we'll go a little stronger to get a lighter look for the handrails. And then of course in the decking in the inside, again we want to come in at that nice lateral angle so it'll pick out some of the grain and leave some shadows in the darker areas. That'll be important later on when we start putting down the foundation colours. Obviously for the underside of the boat, under the decking, we don't need to go in with the white because it is totally in darkness and in shadow. That all done, that's how our piece is looking. Nice black prime, and then going in with that lateral highlight prime, the white Style & Res. So we can still see some shadows, we can still see the grain of the wood. Now, that all said and done, time to put some colour down. We're going to start off, I've got two here, we've got black leather and we've got walnut, both from scale 75 scale colour range. I'm going to start with some walnut. I'm using a well palette because I'm going to thin this right down. This is foundation colour, is going to be more of a wash. I want to keep it nice and light so it'll go into the grain of the wood. We're going to thin it down with a little bit of that Mr. Shy's Painter's Milk. There's a bit of flow aid in it and a little bit of drying retardant. But I want to thin this right down to skimmed milk, I suppose. But again, we're using a well palette rather than mucking up the whole surface of a wet palette. So a little bit of water as well as some of the Painter's Milk. We'll thin that right down. I'm just using an old janky brush here because we're going to wash over the whole thing. You don't need to use one of your better brushes. I just use Sir Janks a lot. This old brush which I've had forever, but it's perfect for doing this. So we're going to lay down a nice thin semi-transparent coat of the walnut and we'll start to stain the wood. And again, where we've left it slightly darker with the black prime, that'll show through, so we already have some shadows straight into the making. So painty. Make sure you get a nice even thin coat of the walnut in all the wooden areas. those both in the highlight and those also in underneath in the shadows. No pooling. If you get any pools, just get rid of the paint on your brush and suck them out. Pools will leave really nasty, crusty, dry lines. We don't want any of that shenanigans. So just a nice, thin, even coat. And again, with the priming that we did, this will allow some of the shadows to look through. So with our whole boat given that nice thin coverage of the thin down walnut, we want to start to intensify that colour. The walnut is a really nice kind of faded old wood colour, so I want to start to intensify some shadows. First of all, throw in a little bit of the old black leather. It's called black leather, it's actually bloody purple, but it does mix nicely into the walnut and it will start to give us some rich, deeper shadows. So we've got a nice rich colour. I want to desaturate this just a smidgen, just a wee tickle, a wee soupçon. So I'm going to throw a wee tickle of flat black in there. Just a wee bit, not too much, don't overdo it. And once again, we want to make sure that we've got a nice thin coat. Again, we're still playing off those deeper shadows from the black primer. So push this darker colour now into those recesses, in under the handrail. Just push them up in anywhere where there's a drop shadow or there's something throwing a shadow over the wood. You can leave some of the more open areas just with that initial walnut. This is more a kind of first shadow that we're putting in now. As we come to the top rail, I want some areas to be a little bit darker than others, so we'll put some of this shadow on, and then we're just going to do a little bit of wet blend, a little bit of feathering, so we don't get any nasty straight dry lines. But again, looking to put the shadow one where the sail is overshadowing the guardrail. And then in under in the decking, where we can see the darker shadows still, we want to intensify those. And of course the back of the main mast, it's leaning over slightly, and when this is up on the Sea King's back, the back of that mast is really going to be in shadow as well. So with all that done and again dried, you can see we're starting to get a little bit of darker, more intense shadows in our recess areas. And we're going to go a little bit further. This time we're going to switch brushes. I don't want Mr. Jankslot anymore. I'm going to use a slightly, I think it's a size 10 Cotman. And this time just black leather and flat black. There's a little walnut still in the well palette. It can stay there. It's doing no harm. But this time we're just going to go with the black leather, which is the purple. And then I will darken it and desaturate it a small bit with the flat black. The flat black is quite a gentle black from scale colour. It's not a true black. So it's not too harsh for mixing into the black leather. And again, we'll use a better brush this time with a proper point on it. Because this time it's going to be more of an actual targeted recess shadow than anything else. So again, thin it down, not as thin as before, but still we'll go for full fat milk this time. Thin it down to about that. Don't flood your brush. And then I just check the transparency and consistency on my hand. Lovely jubbly, off we go. So again, this is going to be much more targeted. That's why I'm using a pointier brush. And we're going to do as well, we're going to be feathering it out as we go along, so we don't get any of those nasty dry lines. Load her up, and here we go. So in under that guardrail, it's going to have a nice darker shadow. So we start there in around that nasty old seaweed. There's still a little bit of Mr. Shy's Love Milk in there. So we have a little bit more time, drying time. So I can put on a few areas and then go in and do the feathering. Again, let it go in to the recesses of the grain of the wood. In between the planks and the drop shadow from that metal band that's going around the ship. So I'll normally do an area or two areas at a time. Then wash out the brush, get rid of most of the water. You do not want a sopping brush, you're not scrubbing the floor. And with a nice damp moist brush, just feather out the edges of that targeted shade. Next we'll go inside into the interior decking, and again there's a lot of nice shadow here to put on the floor, so pushing it in against the side wall barrier thingy, and again push it in into all those areas which will be a little bit darker. That bloody mast out of the way. Again, so once you've done one area, you'll be able to wash out the brush and give it a nice old feathering. We don't want any like strong dry lines, they can be kind of ugly. It's as simple as that for the feathering. Don't feather over the entire area you've just painted, just the edges. Give it a little wiggle wiggle and it'll break up those nasty edges. And then into the very deepest recesses, while it's still wet, you can add a little more pigment in just to make it even stronger. Same again for the top of the guardrails. We're just putting little bits of shadow here and there, leaving some areas lighter, and around scratches we'll put in as well, so it'll flow into the recess. But don't do the whole thing. We want to get areas of light and areas of dark. And once again, we're going to get the nice moist clean brush and just feather those out. So with that all done, we can now start looking towards adding some more colour and some highlights into the wood. We're going to use a mixture of walnut, sandalwood and Iroko. God love that Iroko. All from scale 75 scale colour. Walnut again was our base colour for the foundation, so we're going to keep using that. Add a little bit of sandalwood in, a little more sandalwood, and then we'll add in some Iroko as well. So for our highlights, we're obviously going to focus on the areas of the wood that are unobstructed, and then on the edges of any timbers where they come to join together. Don't worry too much about being exact with the grain of the sculpt, because later on we'll be picking that out in which case, but do try to paint with the grain. The first highlight done, we want to go into our second highlight, so we'll just add in a little more sandalwood and then a little bit more Iroko. Go back to the areas we already highlighted and start to improve upon them. Again, working just towards the edges and pulling back along about the grain. Again, do try to paint with the grain of the sculpt, but don't feel you have to pick out every single little splinter. They'll be taken care of later on, but as long as you have your brush strokes going with the grain, it'll look nice and natural. Now we come to the handrails. The handrails in the sculpture are completely smooth, so I wanted to add in a little bit of grain there. Again, this wood has started to rot and everything. It'll start to split, so we want to add in a little of our own texture and a little of our own detail there. So just using the brush very, very lightly with this second highlight, just draw long strokes down over the piece. So we'll start to put in our own wood texture and surfacing. Again, where there's cracks and splinters in it, just tap a little highlight along. And as usual, make sure to pick out any little bits of wood that are sticking out and will catch the light. They're not just catching the light, but they're also the edges that will get kind of bleached by the seawater in the sea. Make sure to pick out these lovely carved elements as well, because they're sticking right out. So again, they get abrased and roughed up and bleached out while in the water. But we want to show them off as well, really highlight them. Getting nice strong highlight on those folded edges of the carved wood. On the figurehead, they'd already sculpted some of the wood grain in, so you can use the edge of the tip just to go over them, so that wood grain will kind of stick out a little bit more. For our final highlight, we're going to add a little bit of birch in. I don't like using pure white, I just find it too harsh. It desaturates too much. So when I use a nice off-white, birch is quite a kind of nice neutral to warm off-white cream. So we'll mix that into our walnut, sandalwood and Iroko mix, and in for the final highlight. Again, picking out the edges and a little bit of the grain, and anywhere where you think you want that bleached out wood to kind of show up. Again, as before, making sure to go with the grain. Not necessarily picking out every bit of sculpted grain, but just making sure your brush strokes are going with the grain. If you don't, it'll look jarring and it'll ruin the effect. Again, on these lovely nice bits of sculpted detail of the figurehead, using nice thin brush strokes of our highlight, again to kind of show a little bit of the grain of the wood showing through. A nice way of getting a thin line is to blade your brush. So load the brush, pull it back, flip it 180, pull it back again, and you'll flatten your tip and you'll get the nicest, thinnest little bladed lines for doing those really fine wood grains. So with our highlights done, we're going to add in a little bit of algae before we actually shade the whole boat. This is just kind of a precursor to the algae. I use Sherwood Green for the lighter green of the algae, and then Ardennes Green for the darker bits of the greens in the algae on the boat. Both from scale colour again. So this algae, we want to look into kind of recesses, cuts and dings in the wood, anywhere that will stay nice and moist for the algae to start growing. Put a little bit of the green in, and again wash out the brush and just give it a little feather. At this point, we're just going to use the Ardennes Green. It's just the perfect depth of a green for our first colour. And again, the algae goes in between the wood, in between the different planks, anywhere where you think it'll look nice to have a little spot of colour. When putting the algae into the wood like this, you can go as nuts as you want. However, for this, as there's all this clingy seaweed hanging off the boat, I didn't want to put too much of the algae in because there's going to be a lot of green coming in later on as it is. So I just wanted to kind of insinuate a little bit of it in the cracks of the wood. When it comes to the figurehead, again into the darker recesses, I want to make sure that we give the whole boat consistent coverage with this nice kind of sea algae that's growing on it. So once we've sketched in our algae, just very, very, very lightly, it's really much more of a sketch and a foundation at this point, which we'll come back to later on. Next thing we want to do is set our transitions and give a little bit more depth and volume to the boat, as well as darkening it down. So for that, from Citadel, a bit of Nuln Oil, a bit of Agrax Earthshade, and a bit more of the painter's milk. Don't thin the Citadel shades down with water. They go kind of funky when they dry, so you're better to use a medium. Lamian medium is fine. I'm using the Painter's Bakery Painter's Milk here, which does the job perfectly. Using a pipette, we'll take a bit of the old Nuln Oil out, and we're going to make up some Magimix. Magimix is really usually 2 parts Nuln Oil, 1 part Agrax Earthshade, and then 1 part solution, like a medium, whichever medium you want to use. Again, the Citadel shades do not do well with water. It gives them a crusty, nasty, crappy old dried finish. So I always use a medium of some sort. Again, I'm using a well palette here because we're making up, this is a big piece, so we're going to need a lot of this this kind of finishing wash. So I use a well palette because I have a big old puddle. If I do it on the wet palette, it'll go all over the shop. So I'm going to mix up a nice bit of Magimix. Again, 2 parts Nuln Oil, 1 part Agrax, and then 1 part medium. You can tweak it yourself. If you want a more brownie wash, more Agrax. Less brownie wash, more Nuln Oil. So mix that up nicely. And we're going to wash the whole boat. Again, none of this pooling shenanigans. So we're going to give the whole boat a nice liberal wash. Again, this will deepen the wood, it'll go into the recesses, it'll pick out the wood grain, and it'll smooth some of our transitions as well. Again, no pools needed, so we pull into the recesses. If you do get a pool, empty your brush, and then just use the brush to suck it back out. Always pull in towards your recesses because it's going to leave the most behind wherever you pull your brush up. So you want that to be in a shadow area rather than a highlight area. And we'll speed it up because we're going to give this whole thing a nice liberal wash. You can see how it's richening and deepening the wood as we go along. Don't be afraid to use a washer shades from time to time. Some folk witter on that, oh, using shades and washes is no good. It's plenty good. You can use them as glazes, as filters. There's a lot of different uses. They're still very, very useful. Whether you use the GW shades or you can use the Army Painter Quick shades, doesn't really matter. If you have any leftover Magimix, don't throw it out. Don't waste it. GW stuff's bloody expensive as it is. Save it. Use the pipette and then pop it into an empty dropper bottle. And there you go. You've got some Magimix pre-made for next time. I love that Magimix. So with the wash nice and all dried, we're going to go back in first with our Ardennes Green, and we're going to reinstall and re-emphasize our little patches of algae on the wood. Use the darker green first as your base and push it back into where we sketched some of that green earlier on, though not covering quite as much this time. Push it into those recesses and then feather out a little bit where necessary. Make sure you've got a nice solid strong green right in the recesses, in any cracks, any splits, any meetings of different planks of wood. Anywhere which will always stay moist and the algae can thrive and grow in. Once you're done with the darker green, we're going to go back in with a little of this brighter Sherwood Green, and we're going to add some little bits of bright, fresher growing algae in on top. Don't use as much as before, hitting a few areas just to make them pop. The Sherwood Green is nice and bright when you put it on, but it does dry back a little darker, so it's good to do one application and then come back in with a few extra spots. Drive it down into those nice recesses. And with a few little final spots of that nice bright algae, we are just about done this side of the ship. There we have it, our old janky bleached out sea wood. If you want to deepen it, you can go back in with a little bit more Magimix. I'd add a little bit of Druchii Violet into the Magimix as well, just to consolidate those kind of slight brown tones we still have and to deepen it further. But with old seawood like this, I wanted to show kind of bleached out as well, so I don't want to go too dark. Folks, thanks a million for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy, please hit like, click on subscribe, ding that bell and set it to all so you will get notified whenever a new video comes up. Between now and then, if you want to catch me again, you can find me over on Twitch 3 days a week, painting all the miniatures.